This is a preview video on the autonomic nervous system. This is chapter 9 in your textbook. The learning objectives that we're going to cover are the role of the autonomic nervous system in homeostasis, such as blood pressure and temperature. We'll talk a little bit about the wiring systems called the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and we'll talk about their control of the heart, bladder, and digestive tract. We'll talk a little bit about neurotransmitters used by these neuron systems, these control systems. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine will be the primary neurotransmitters that we'll keep mentioning when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic wiring tends to use acetylcholine at target organs, where the sympathetic uses norepinephrine. Okay, let's talk a little bit about homeostasis. Again, we have our brain, which is the controller in homeostasis. In terms of the autonomic nervous system, the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus will be the primary brain areas controlling our autonomic nervous system. And so, for example, temperature and blood pressure are important homeostatic variables. We want to keep our blood pressure constant, and we want to keep our blood pressure constant throughout the day. And so this is going to rely on our autonomic nervous system, including the hypothalamus and the medulla, and then the wiring that extends from our brain. So key autonomic brain regions, again, hypothalamus and the medulla are important. The medulla we call life support, and the hypothalamus can help influence the medulla as well. And then the hypothalamus also has key areas for temperature regulation as well. So keep these in mind whenever you hear autonomic control. Again, what is our autonomic nervous system controlling? Well, it's controlling our heart, for example, increasing or decreasing heart rate, controlling our bladder, controlling our digestive organs. Whereas your somatic nervous system is controlling, or at least the motor side of it, is controlling your skeletal muscle and your voluntary movements, just as moving your eyes around or writing notes. So the wiring system for these are separate and different. The autonomic wiring system is separate from the somatic wiring system, and they use sometimes different neurotransmitters. Okay, so let's assume your blood pressure gets too low and you start to feel dizzy. Your brain's not going to like that. So it'll activate the autonomic nervous system to increase your heart rate and also increase the force of contraction of your heart. Your heart will feel like it's pounding. The autonomic nervous system will also change blood flow, so to decrease skin blood flow and digestive blood flow to keep that blood available for your heart and your brain. And so that will hopefully raise our blood pressure back up. So that's how our autonomic nervous system can help regulate blood pressure. Again, we'll talk about the wiring and the hormones in a minute. So what about temperature? Let's say it's Mesa and it's 115 degrees in the summertime. Your body temperature starts to increase due to the high ambient temperature. Your brain doesn't like that. So the autonomic nervous system, again, can respond. How are we going to respond to this increased body temperature? Well, one thing is to send our blood flow, our warm blood, out to our skin to cool off. So we increase skin blood flow when we're hot. We also activate those eccrine sweat glands in our skin, so they produce more sweat, and that helps cool off your skin through evaporation. So again, this is the autonomic nervous system responding to help cool you off. And it'll involve those brain regions we just mentioned, the hypothalamus and the medulla, and also the wiring system, which we're going to talk about in a second. So some things that the somatic nervous system controls, basically skeletal muscle. I mean, that's the control of the somatic nervous system, your voluntary control. What about the autonomic nervous system? Well, we mentioned blood pressure and we mentioned temperature as control of our autonomic nervous system, or variables that our autonomic nervous system controls through the heart and blood vessels and sweat glands. What about other things? Well, blood flow distribution and heart rate and force of contraction of the heart we just mentioned, but also digestive activity, secretion, saliva, motility, things that you might not think about, like the airways in your lungs, going to and from your lungs. The iris in your eye is made of smooth muscle, and so our autonomic nervous system can control that. Tear glands, also the bladder, defecation, vomiting, even sexual function is all regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So we'll talk more about these throughout the semester when we cover the different organ systems. So just as a little bit of a review, you can always pause this slide. Autonomic nervous system controlling things like our heart and glands and smooth muscle. Somatic nervous system controlling skeletal muscle. Sometimes there can be mashups between the two. The best examples I can think are swallowing and breathing, where actually your autonomic brain regions control skeletal muscle. So, but most of the time we'll talk about purely autonomic and purely somatic function. The spinal cord is wired up again, and the autonomic wiring is separate from our somatic wiring. So I've drawn here a motor neuron going from our ventral portion of our spinal cord out to control your biceps. If we looked at our sympathetic nervous system, for example, controlling, say, your intestines, it actually is wired up from the lateral horn, so slightly different wires and sometimes different nerves for the autonomic nervous system. So here on the other side, I'm showing a sympathetic neuron chain going to a sweat gland in the skin, and you can see the wiring is slightly different to control the autonomic nervous system. Okay, let's look at examples of the wiring divisions of our autonomic nervous system, and they're called sympathetic and parasympathetic, and you can just think of them as two wiring or control systems. And we're going to talk about the bladder, the heart, and digestive system, so you can see the dual control by these two wiring systems of the autonomic nervous system. And they also use different neurotransmitters so that they can have opposite effects, often on our organs. So overall, the autonomic divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, can be kind of lumped together in what they actually cause the body to do. So for the sympathetic division, or often we just call it the sympathetic nervous system, it's often involved in fight or flight and exercise. So think of things you need to do to fight, flight, run, or exercise. You need to increase your heart rate, you need to increase your blood pressure, you increase sweating. And so again, whenever you're trying to think of, would this be controlled by the sympathetic or parasympathetic, I like to remember fight, flight, or exercise. For the parasympathetic nervous system, we usually think rest and digest. So whenever you're digesting food or peeing, these are usually regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system, and they have the opposite effect, so decreasing heart rate and decreasing blood pressure. And so the parasympathetic really start thinking about digestion of food. And so they don't always have a an opposite effect, but for our beginning class we will. We'll think about most of the time the parasympathetic and the sympathetic have opposite effects on their target organs. So it's a dual control system. If one turns the heart on, the other will turn the heart off. If one turns the stomach on, the other will turn the stomach off. And again, it's a simplification, but it works for our class. So let's look a little anatomically at the wiring. The wiring is different between these two parts of the autonomic nervous system. So if we look at our brain and spinal cord, again, we have our brain regions like the medulla and the hypothalamus. If we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, the wiring tends to come down cranial nerves directly off the brain to many of our organs. And so these cranial nerves actually carry our parasympathetic wiring to our heart and our stomach, or even maybe the iris of our eye. And also, we also see some wiring from the parasympathetic nervous system that goes all the way down our spinal cord to the sacral spinal region. So sacral spinal nerves also are carrying wiring for our parasympathetic nervous system. And that's where we pretty much see the wiring, cranial nerves and sacral spinal nerves, for the parasympathetic wiring to things like our heart, stomach, and bladder. Okay, so that's the wiring for our parasympathetic nervous system to our target organs. Then if we look at the sympathetic wiring, it comes down the spinal cord. The sympathetic wiring comes down our spinal cord. Instead of exiting down at the sacral region, it tends to exit in the lumbar and thoracic region. So you see these little neurons exit in the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves. They then synapse on secondary neurons in sympathetic ganglia. So ganglia are where these neurons of the sympathetic nervous system communicate. So, and then after that, neurons extend to our target organs, such as the heart, the iris, the stomach, or the bladder. So what we see here now is that we've got separate wiring for our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Again, the sympathetic tends to come from the thoracic and lumbar regions of our spinal cord, whereas the parasympathetic comes from cranial nerves directly off the brainstem or sacral spinal nerves. So one of the things we can learn is that the wiring is different, so we can identify whether we're looking at sympathetic or parasympathetic neurons. The other thing is that these neurons need to release different neurotransmitters, chemicals, in order to cause the organs to do different things. So if the parasympathetic nervous system wants to slow down the heart, it will use acetylcholine. If the sympathetic nervous system wants to increase the heart rate, it will use norepinephrine. So they use different chemicals to cause different effects at the same exact organ. And this is just a textbook diagram. If you prefer that, you can pause it and check it out. But you can see the parasympathetic and the sympathetic wiring to the same organs comes from different regions. Okay, let's look more specifically at what these wiring systems do differently to our bladder, our stomach, and our heart. Okay, and so we're basically talking about the bladder filling or emptying, the heart speeding it up or slowing it down, the stomach making stomach acid, contracting it, or relaxing it. So we want to know which of these actions will occur when we activate our parasympathetic versus our sympathetic nervous system. All right, so here's the wiring for our bladder. Let's look at the sympathetic side of things. The sympathetic wiring again would come from our lumbar region, and these neurons would release norepinephrine. Norepinephrine relaxes the smooth muscle of the bladder so that your bladder can fill. If we look at the parasympathetic wiring, which probably comes from the sacral region, we see that those neurons then release acetylcholine, and that causes the little smooth muscle cells of my bladder to contract, and that would help push the pee out and cause contraction of my bladder. So again, they're having different effects depending on whether you activate the parasympathetic or sympathetic wiring. And if you're saying, wait a second, I control when I pee voluntarily, well, actually the somatic nervous system controls a skeletal muscle sphincter, which then you need to relax, which you do when you want to pee. So that's how you get the voluntary control of when you pee. But it's the parasympathetic nervous system and acetylcholine which is actually causing your bladder to contract and push the urine out. Okay, let's look at the heart. The heart is wired up to our parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons. This parasympathetic neurons, again, release acetylcholine at the heart. Acetylcholine tends to tell the heart cells to slow down, so it decreases heart rate. The sympathetic wiring, the sympathetic neurons release norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, which tends to increase heart rate. So remember, the heart can pace itself, and the heart likes to pace itself about 80 to 100. It doesn't need any neuron to tell it to do that. But the sympathetic nervous system can increase your heart rate, such as during exercise, and the parasympathetic can slow down your heart rate, say at rest. So your heart rate can vary widely from 200 to maybe even 40 or 50 beats per minute. Let's look at an example where if you lost a lot of blood, what would need to happen? Well, the brain would get upset because your blood pressure is low. It would activate the sympathetic nervous system, and you would release lots of norepinephrine on the heart to increase heart rate and force of contraction, and you'd pump more and more blood. The brain would also turn off the parasympathetic wiring so that you would increase your heart rate. Okay, so if we look at the stomach, remember, parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest. So when you activate your parasympathetic nervous system and acetylcholine, it'll increase stomach acid production, increase contraction of your stomach, and overall increase digestive activity of the stomach. Whereas the sympathetic would have the opposite effects, decreasing digestion. Okay, so that's control of those organs by the dual wiring system and the autonomic nervous system. If we look more about the wiring, I just wanted to point out, since we learned the spinal cord, if we look at skeletal muscle control, again, the wiring goes from that ventral horn through the ventral root to our muscles. It takes just one neuron to go from spinal cord to skeletal muscle, and to cause skeletal muscle contraction. If we look at the autonomic wiring from our spinal cord, it's a little different. And so I wanted to point that out. So let's say you have a sweat gland in your skin and you want to control that sweat gland by your autonomic nervous system. The autonomic wiring comes out the lateral horn of our spinal cord. And also you notice it takes a 2-neuron chain to actually communicate with that sweat gland. And so the first neuron communicates with the second neuron at what we call a ganglion. Plural is ganglia. And so you find these autonomic ganglia throughout your autonomic nervous system. And so the autonomic nervous system always takes a two-neuron chain to go from your spinal cord or your brainstem to your target organ. And they communicate in these ganglia. And if we look at the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglia are located in different places. The ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system are located close to the spinal cord, and the ganglia of the parasympathetic nervous system are located closer to the organ. So this is an anatomical distinction that we can remember. And also we know that the neurotransmitters released by the neurons at the target organs are different. So these are some things we can keep in mind to know whether we're looking at parasympathetic or sympathetic wiring. So let's look at this diagram. I'll try to help explain it here. We see our spinal cord in our brain. We see the regions of our spinal cord, right? Sacral, thoracic, and lumbar. We see our brain up at the top, and we see these wirings. So if we see this wire, this neuron, going from our lumbar region of our spinal cord all the way to skeletal muscle, that's got to be a somatic motor neuron controlling skeletal muscle. If we see a lumbar neuron extending out to a ganglion, and then that second neuron extends to our bladder, and it's coming from the lumbar region, and the ganglia is close to our spinal cord, then we know that must be a sympathetic neuron chain, and it should release norepinephrine and relax our bladder. If we see a sacral neuron extending to a ganglion very close to our bladder, and it releases ACH, which causes our bladder to contract and cause peeing, we'll assume that that must be a parasympathetic wiring or neuron chain. And of course, we also have somatic wiring to things like our legs and our feet and our sphincters. So I just wanted you to see anatomically sort of how these wiring systems are distinct and separate. Let's look at our heart. So if we find the two-neuron chain to our heart, the sympathetic neuron will come from the thoracic region, release norepinephrine to increase our heart rate. The parasympathetic wiring will come from a cranial nerve actually off our brainstem, and again the ganglion will be close to our heart, and the second neuron will release acetylcholine, which will decrease our heart rate. So notice that the ganglia are in different positions for the sympathetic and parasympathetic wiring. Close to the spinal cord for the sympathetic nervous system and closer to the target organ for the parasympathetic. If we look at the iris of our eye, they have opposite effects. Sympathetic dilates your iris and opens up that pupil, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system causes that iris to contract or constrict, which makes your pupil smaller. All right, so hopefully you feel like an expert of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. I wanted to point out that the airways and the large tubes, airways that go to your lungs, to and from your lungs, the airways such as bronchi and bronchioles also have smooth muscle lining them, and so since they have smooth muscle, those tubes can change shape and size, and so this is also controlled by your autonomic nervous system. So we can have those tubes either become bigger and dilate or become smaller and constrict. And so this helps or hinders airflow. It turns out that the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system are wired up, where ACH causes constriction of those airways and norepinephrine causes dilation by affecting those smooth muscles. So if you relax the smooth muscles, those airways become bigger. We'll talk more about that, how that relates to asthma. So we're already familiar with the neurotransmitters used by our autonomic neurons. The autonomic neurons at our target organs like to release ACH and norepinephrine. And so if we look at that, norepinephrine is the sympathetic and acetylcholine is parasympathetic. I just wanted to point out that the preganglionic neurons, the neurons leading up to the ganglia, for both systems use acetylcholine to signal. But once we get to the target organs, then they use different neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters bind to receptor proteins on their targets, smooth muscle, cardiac cells, and then those have actions. So that's important that those neurotransmitters bind to a receptor to actually cause an action at the target organ, such as increasing heart rate or decreasing heart rate, or causing your bladder to contract or relax. So let's look at that to make sure that's clear. If we look at a bladder smooth muscle cell, it's sitting there in your bladder wall, and it has receptor proteins for norepinephrine, and those receptor proteins then can bind to chemicals like neurotransmitters. It also has separate proteins that are considered ACH or acetylcholine receptors. So remember, when norepinephrine is released from a neuron in your sympathetic nervous system, it will bind to that receptor protein, which will then tell that little smooth muscle cell that it should relax. And it'll actually cause mechanisms in the cell so that there's relaxation. Acetylcholine, on the other hand, will bind to its receptor when present, and when that binds, it'll tell the little cell that it should contract. And so then that would have the opposite effect, causing it to push out urine out of the bladder. So again, these neurotransmitters have their actions at receptor proteins in the cell membrane. And it just depends on which of those neurotransmitters is in higher amounts to depend whether it's relaxed or contracted. I wanted to point out, since we're learning the names of neurotransmitters, adrenaline is the British name for the U.S. Substance called epinephrine. Epinephrine is a chemical very closely related to norepinephrine, the chemical neurotransmitter of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic side. And also, epinephrine is a hormone released often by your sympathetic nervous system too. So we'll talk more about epinephrine when we talk about the endocrine system. But I just wanted to point out that in the United States, we don't say adrenaline, we say epinephrine, and norepinephrine is closely related to epinephrine. And they have similar effects. For example, on the heart, they increase heart rate and increase the force of contraction. And drugs often will mimic our autonomic neurotransmitters. So let's look at that. So here's an example where we know that the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate and force of heart contraction with norepinephrine. Well, there's a drug called a beta blocker, which actually is able to block the norepinephrine receptor, which is called a beta receptor. The norepinephrine receptor is called a beta adrenergic receptor. We just call it beta receptor for short. Well, these drugs block that receptor so that norepinephrine can't bind to the receptor. If norepinephrine can't bind to the receptor, your heart rate will decrease and your heart will pound will not pound as much, which decreases your heart rate and decreases your blood pressure. So that's an example of a drug that can be used for hypertension or simply to decrease your heart rate. So that's just an example of using what we know about the autonomic nervous system to treat people. Another example targets the bladder. So remember, the parasympathetic nervous system using acetylcholine causes your bladder to contract. Well, some people, their bladder contracts too much. So there's this drug that blocks the acetylcholine receptor, which is called the muscarinic receptor. This drug that blocks the acetylcholine receptor then basically is going to cause those little bladder smooth muscle cells to relax. Again, it physically blocks the protein that usually will bind ACH. If those little smooth muscle cells can't bind ACH, you basically block the bladder contraction or relax your bladder. And that helps people that have too much urgency or accidental contraction of their bladder, urinary incontinence, if you've heard of that. The side effects, though, are pretty dramatic. Dry eyes, dry mouth, and constipation. Well, it turns out that your lacrimal glands, your salivary glands, and even your digestive tube are all affected by ACH. ACH activates those. So if you're blocking ACH, you can block tears, you can block motility in your digestive tract, etc. Okay, a final example of how we use drugs that involve the autonomic pathways. Asthma is caused by constriction of the airways, which is not so good, right, if you have asthma. Well, it turns out that the sympathetic nervous system dilates or opens up those airways. So many of the drugs that treat asthma will actually activate the sympathetic side, the norepinephrine, epinephrine signaling, and cause those little smooth muscle cells in your airways to open up. And if you've ever heard of albuterol for asthma, that's a bronchodilator. It opens up the airways by mimicking norepinephrine and epinephrine, and so helps you with asthma. So just examples of drugs that target your autonomic nervous system. That is the end, and so we'll cover more of this in class, and I will see you guys.